Welcome you to this book launch. It's very exciting to be here with two of the authors of the book Broken Bonds, the Existential Crisis of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood 2013-2022. My name is Jeroen Gunning. I'm a professor at the other side of the road at King's College, Middle East politics and conflict studies. I've studied Hamas for part of my kind of career, and so therefore very interested in Muslim Brotherhood type organizations and how they evolve over time, and also the relationship between sort of violence, repression, and sort of counter responses, etc. So I'm very interested to read your book and also get a discussion afterwards. Just to note that the event is going to be recorded and there will be pictures being taken throughout. So I hope that I have your consent for this. If not, you have to raise it with Nadine back there. Also note that copies of the book will be available to take for free at the back of the room at the end. The other thing I wanted to say before I introduce you, there was something else. No, it's gone. Okay, it will come back if it's important. Right. So we're very pleased to have two of the speakers here tonight. So Abdelrahman Ayyash is next to me. He's a fellow at the Century International and director of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood Working Group there. He translated 3 books on civil-military relations and the Muslim Brotherhood, and has published reports and articles about the Muslim Brotherhood for institutions, including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Arab Reform Initiative. And next to Abdelrahman is Amr ElAfifi, who is the research manager at the Freedom Initiative, Washington, DC-based NGO focused on human rights in the Middle East. And his current dissertation research at Syracuse University explores the political psychology of trauma amongst political prisoners. So you can see that there's a lot of overlap with their work and in this book as well. Right, now I remember what I was going to say, which fits nicely here. So what we're going to do is Amr and Abdelrahman are going to speak for about 10 minutes about the book, sort of highlighting some key themes. Then there's going to be a Q&A just between the 3 of us, where we pick up some of these themes and sort of dig some deeper into that for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we throw open the floor, and then you can all sort of ask questions and we can continue that. Because this has worked in the past quite well, and so we'll see how it works tonight. Right, so over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the LLC Middle East Center for organizing. Thank you to Nadine for making sure this happened. And thank you so much for agreeing to share the event. And it's an honor to share this with you. Thank you all for attending as well. The book is a truly collaborative effort. We lucky to have worked on this together. Ayyash is a very smart researcher and scholar who has been thinking critically and working on Muslim Brotherhood since 2006. As part of the movement of bloggers. That if you read the book, you'll find a long prologue that talks a little bit about that. But he's part of some of the later iterations of what we study at some point, and someone who has been publishing about this for quite a while. Noha is a historical sociologist who thinks a lot about, and has written quite a bit about Egyptian nationalism in the late 20th century and how the Muslim Brotherhood fits into that story. And we'll hear a little bit about that too. And for better or worse, I'm a political scientist or one in training. And my work on trauma and political imprisonment and what that means and what it means at the individual and at the communal level as well, sort of brought us all together to think about the different levers of what we're trying to argue in this book, in the sense that there's an identity crisis that the Brotherhood is undergoing that I'll talk about a bit in a minute, that fits within like the historical context that it came out of, that it in some ways has moved on from, but in others it hasn't. And legitimacy crisis in terms of like how this very patriarchal type of organization contends with authority and contends with legitimacy and what that means and how that bears on their politics moving forward. And also at the individual level, like what it feels like to be a member, an older member, a younger member who has gone torture, who has gone in prison, who has undergone like different periods of imprisonment, and how that affects their commitment to the organization, their commitment to the cause, and their own life trajectory. So what is this book and what is it? This book is a book that's based on 18 months of ethnographic work and interviews of senior leaders, former members in the US, the UK, Qatar, Malaysia, Turkey, and Germany. So quite a bit of traveling and jumping around and talking to people. But it's something that I think was quite necessary. I mean, the complexity of the organization, especially the organization in exile, sort of necessitated and required this. And we argue mainly that some of the tools that the organization had developed to cope with certain historical incidents throughout the waves of repression that they've undergone, especially in like the post-1952 Egypt, worked really well for them at one point. But then when this crisis happened, it sort of became the same tools that stood between them and like and coping with the crisis as best as they could have, or growing or dealing with the different waves of repression. And under that, we say that there are three main crises the organization is undergoing. An identity crisis. By identity crisis, we essentially say that the organization at some point maybe knew what it wanted to be, what it grew up, but now it really doesn't. And that it grew in tandem with Egyptian nationalism, and it sprung out of that, but it never really had a positive definition of itself. And it sort of like molded and morphed itself around what was happening. So when you look at their political ideology, for instance, if the state is to the left, they're a little bit to the left. If the state is to the right, they're a little bit to the right. And it's that adaptability that helped them a lot at one point. But when push came to shove, and when they were in government, and when they had to run the country, and when they had to offer something positive, despite the repression that happened, there was not much there. And then when the crackdown happened, there was even less. And that there's a legitimacy crisis that happens where for too long, the legitimacy being within the organization was based on ordeals, right? So there's a cadre of members who had undergone horrific torture and imprisonment in the 60s under Nasser, people who had spent some time with Hassan al-Banna before he was eventually assassinated, right? And there was like either an ordeal-based legitimacy or sort of like a founding fathers-based legitimacy. And then when the founding father people died, the ordeal started becoming a lot more important. But then in the midst of this crisis, when you don't have the 60s ordeal to go back to and sort of like build your legitimacy that way, you see this tension between people who had undergone these waves of repression historically, and then people who are sort of like closer to our age cohort, right, who have undergone CC, or like this, like a CC-based ordeal legitimacy, right, or like these. So people who are much younger, lower ranking in the organization, who have gone the same atrocities, and then you can't use that sort of like moral superiority thing over them. Like, I've seen this, you haven't, type thing, because now people in their 20s and 30s have seen similar types of repression, and the crackdown sort of flattened that, right? And the organization really never had bylaws and stuff like that to build it back up. And I think we'll talk about that moving on. And finally, the last crisis is the membership crisis. An organization that was like very proud at some point that it's able to mobilize people to the streets, and that it was able to recruit folk in different ways, either through helping them through universities or through charitable donations and stuff like that. The organization at some point does not have the same society that it was in, because now it's torn between all the countries that we went to and interviewed folk, or we talked to folk into. It doesn't have the same amount of money that it used to, because like repression has cost them quite a bit of money, and it's extended their resources. And it also does not have the same answers that it used to, because like within the context of Egyptian politics, it's like, and under severe repression, there's only so much you can do vis-a-vis the state. You don't have to be very politically sophisticated, but similar to what we discovered when we were talking to Ibrahim Munir before he passed in November 2022, we asked, like, I think Russia, the war in Ukraine was happening, what strategic power competition was starting to come back to the agenda in terms of like how the US thinks of itself, and we're changing from like a unipolar world to a multipolar, bipolar, however many polars we want to think of, and nodes of influence and all that type of stuff. Ibrahim Munir couldn't fathom, and I think the organization could not fathom how it relates to itself in the like a regional context, in a global context, and an international system context. And members are disillusioned by this, and the organization that was once everything for them no longer had the answers that they were looking for, or no longer had answers to these crises. I'll stop here. Ayyash will say add some more, and then we'll get to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hamza, and thanks everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being the Middle East Center at LSE for inviting us. Of course, yeah, I'd like to start by acknowledging what's going on in this time. It's very difficult actually to speak about anything that could be more important than what's going on in Gaza and the genocide that's has been going on for almost 20 days now. But I think what we are going to say here, I think some of it could be explanatory to what's going on, and I think it could be useful to understand some of the dynamics in Palestine, Israel as well as in Egypt. So yeah, I want to start by saying a few main takeaways of the book that I think are very important, and I think as Amr mentioned, what we argued, the crises that we discussed, but really there are a few main points that we'd love if you just get them from what we wrote. The first point is that there is a real confusion between Islam and Islamism, and many researchers who have been studying Islam, have been studying Islamic movements. They have been mixing between both, and I think this led to a very misleading conclusions and misunderstanding to the real problems of Egypt and the Islamic movements at large. I mean, when people start talking about Ikhwan or about the Muslim Brotherhood, they literally start talking about Islam. So they don't ask the question about the Muslim Brotherhood and democracy. No, they say Islam and democracy, Islam and women, Islam and human rights. So, but it's not about the Islamists, and I don't like to use the word Islamists that much, but yeah. So what we wanted to differentiate or to say here, that a real differentiation is important, because some words that are like Islamists or political Islam, they could have some explanatory power, but they are not universal and they are not able actually to explain everything. What I want to say is that if we are talking about Islam or Islamic movements, people actually, and I think this could be a segue to talk about Hamas and what's going on in Palestine as well, there is this trend of the ISISification of Islamic movements. It happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt post-2013. You'll find a lot of Islamic institutions, not Al-Azhar per se, but some Islamic scholars comparing between the Muslim Brotherhood and Khawarij or ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all that. But if you are looking in the different responses of Islamists or Islamic movements to different challenges, and if you will have a constant that is Islam, and the Islamic component will be Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think by definition, or by very basic analysis, it will not be the factor that the defining factor for the changing responses of these movements. And I think this is one of the first important things that we need to say, is that many ideas and responses that come out of Islamic movements are not because of the Islamic component of them, but because of the environment they are in, the socioeconomic conditions that they grow in. The other takeaway is that the Muslim Brotherhood is not only, or most of the Islamic groups actually are not only motivated by ideology. It's very important to understand how many researchers, when they study the Muslim Brotherhood, they focus on the Muslim part and not the Brotherhood part. But if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood as a multifaceted phenomena that has a lot of complicated layers and dynamics between the members, the leaderships, the ideology, and the interpretations of texts. Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that whatever defines the responses and the reactions of Islamic movements could be many things other than only ideology. The third takeaway is that I believe, and I think it's safe to say that we believe, that the biggest challenge to democracy actually, it's not the opposition, it's not the Middle East opponent groups, and of course they are not Islamic movements. What we are saying and what we are talking about is that the establishment actually have been or has been affecting the responses of these organizations, the Islamic organizations and the opponents in many countries, not only in Egypt. I'm not taking away the agency of these organizations and their moral responsibility, but I think that in what we have seen in Egypt and what we have seen in many other countries, including Tunisia, for example, the establishment, whether the military, the bureaucracy, the deep state, and of course the judiciary, the intelligence, the Ministry of Interiors, all of that, they could be much more effective or much more important factors on democratic transitions and on democracy than the Islamic movements. So the next takeaway is that CP and security approaches, they do not work to understand Islamists and to understand Islamic movements.
Can you just spell out CP?
Yeah. Countering violent extremism. I think it's many researchers, when they study Islamic movements, they just look at them as, again, a security threat. They are not as a multifaceted phenomena as we were saying earlier. And I think it's the existing research on Islamists, it varies a lot between some of them, or some of these researchers are very simplistic, and some others are pretty comprehensive. And I think some researchers actually are affected by many other factors that don't necessarily mean that they are objective. Regional powers in the Middle East are affecting research that is coming out from Washington, for example, and many other countries as well. The last takeaway that I wanted to mention before moving back to Jeroen and Amr is that you cannot annihilate the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic movements without annihilating the grievances and the problems and the questions that they rose to answer in the first place. And I think this is a real problem in Egypt and in other countries as well. And I think we shall witness this in Palestine as well, in Gaza. I mean, no matter what the political power or the authorities will do, they will not be able to end the response to a problem without ending the problems. And I think when the Muslim Brotherhood first started or initiated in 1920s, 1928, they were coming out to respond to many problems in Egypt at the time, starting from, of course, the fall of the Caliphate or the fall of the Ottoman Empire a few years before that, but also to the missionaries, the Christian missionaries coming to Egypt at the time. And this is very important, a very important note to say that the Muslim Brotherhood, when they started, they focused on actually the same tactics and the same tools that the missionaries were using in Egypt at the time. So they were using hospitals and schools mainly to counter this effect. So what I'm trying to say is that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic movements, and what we are trying to say in the book, that these movements are organic to the society. They are they were actually there for a very long time, and they are part in Egypt. For example, they are part of the Egyptian nationalism, the Egyptian liberation movement that started with the British or during the British occupation in the early 20th century. And there are many problems that are rooted in the society and the state in Egypt that are not addressed or that were not addressed yet. Hence, the Muslim Brotherhood and other manifestations of this phenomena will keep rising until these problems are addressed.
Thank you both. I think that's a very good introduction to build on. First of all, I really recommend you read the book. It is the details of it is extraordinary, and I think the three perspectives that you bring together really speak to each other, and you can see that in the book and how it's explained. So yeah, I very much recommend that you take away a copy at the end of this. I wanted to kind of so there's a lot of very interesting material on the Muslim Brotherhood, but I want to somehow to kind of link it to broader questions that often become discussed when it comes to opposition movements in governments that go through different repressive phases. And so I want to ask first about there's the whole literature on inclusion, moderation, or the obviously exclusion, radicalization. That if groups get included in the political process, that they become more kind of moderate, whatever that means in that particular context, but more pragmatic, playing by the rules of the state, etc. Whereas if they're excluded, then they might become more radical in their means and etc. Now, what's interesting, you describe particularly the clampdowns under Mubarak in the 90s, and then on the Sisi in the 2010s, and the response of the Muslim Brotherhood's organization and of members is very different between those. In the 90s, you described it as more a withdrawal from politics and moving into civil society and the religious sphere, and almost a Salafization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Whereas in the 2010s, a lot of the response that becomes street protests, more fighting, violence, etc., but also the disintegration of a lot of the institutional structures of the movement. And I just wanted whether, in the context of these broader debates of inclusion, moderation, exclusion, radicalization, but you could say a little bit also comparing the different kind of periods. I mean, you don't say that much on the Nasser period in there, except in terms of the legacy that leaders have from that period. But maybe comparing the clampdowns under Nasser, Mubarak, and Sisi, and then versus the semi-inclusions under Sadat in the 1970s, and then in the 2000s, the brief opening, and then 2011, 2013. And maybe say a little bit what you think that this particular case says to these broader views, which are often very simplistic, right? And I think you paint a much more complex picture here.
So there's a lot there to chew on, so I'll try to respond to bits of it, and then Ayyash will fill in any gaps or any additions. I think with the moderation and inclusion literature, there's always this big element of and this is Fredler's work and some other work that's going to come out of moderation towards what, right? Or moderation from what and towards whom, right? Yeah. And I think and some of it has to go with this inherent assumption that these people who self-identify sometimes or are called Islamists or sometimes also self-identify as Islamists, and that there's something inherently wrong with the way they're arguing, and they often are quite misogynistic and racist and horrible in some of their views, right? But there's something that we're if we change a couple of ideas, if they're included into the political party, they're included in parliament, that they have to moderate for whatever reason, and they become less scary, right? But I think the issue with that is what is the normative basis against which we're basing this moderation to, right? So are we looking at certain indicators that are inherent in the state, for instance, right? And that's the basis that's the normative basis against which the Muslim Brotherhood would be leaning towards. Are we looking at certain global value indicators? Is it against this inherent liberal democratic assumption that they're moving towards, and therefore they are moderating or becoming better actors better actors to deal with, right? Or more comprehensive actors to us. And I'm not sure that necessarily makes sense, even if we think of because if you think of today's Sisi, for instance, right? Today's Sisi and Morsi before he passed, the rhetoric they espouse, Sisi's rhetoric is super religious, right? Monica Marx has done some work on this, right? You can think of Sisi as an Islamist. So in Egypt, he's our first Islamist dictator, so to say, or a military Islamist dictator. Sisi believes that he gets divine visions and interventions from God. He said things if we were doing the wrong thing, if God was not with us, how could have we accomplished all of this? He said things like, I've seen in my visions that I've seen visions that God has told me, you're right, keep on going, keep on doing this. I've seen a sword in my hand and a watch on my arm and all this type of like really weird stuff that's like can be like swiped off or like swept under the rug as ridiculous, but it also speaks to like a deeply inherent religious ideology. If we're going to take like religion at the face value of this, right? Is there like a deeper ideology behind this, similar to the Ikhwan? Maybe. Could it be a little bit different? Definitely. Do you know? So I think like when we think of like the normative basis against which we're like moderating towards, that we need to complicate that quite a bit before we think of like moderation and inclusion as necessarily happening. But when we think of like the opposite of it, right, this radicalization exclusion bit, and we see this in prisons in Egypt too, right? Like people that I've spoken to for the human rights stuff, not for this book, who are close to the state say stuff like, we're worried that if we let the bits of the 60,000 political prisoners who are in prison, who are mostly dissidents, most of whom are probably related or like are assumed to be closely related to the Brotherhood in some way or another, whatever that might mean, is that they're going to march through the streets and like being radicalized. They're in prison, they're radicalized, they're full of grievances. They might have met some ISIS people in there, right? And they're going to come out and they're going to blow things up. The problem with that, and we see this in how the state operates as well, right? So before there's any presidential pardons in Egypt, and this happens, does not happen as often as it should, but every couple of years, there's some people who are released, people who are state religious ideologues, like Usama al-Azhari, for instance, and if you've ever had to hear him talk, I'm very sorry, come out or go to prisons and talk to people and talk to these young men, mostly who have been in prison for close to 10 years or so, and he talks to them and he just like does ideological checks on them to make sure whether or not they've been radicalized, right? But what we've seen from like the people who have been released is that there has not been much radicalization. There's been like increased exclusion that has happened in terms of the type of social stigma that they're under as former political detainees, being alienated from society, unable to get jobs, being routinely checked on by security officers, by Amr ElAfifi, by other types of entities that sort of like prolong the period of repression, but we haven't seen any radicalization. So there's no data, at least in this Egyptian context, to support that. What we do see, however, in terms of this radicalization stuff, is that the state deals very differently with members of extremist groups as opposed to members of the Ikhwan, as opposed to members of like liberal and leftist groups and stuff like that. And I say this not to say that the state is right or wrong, but that even the state itself, I think on some level, at the working level of officers who are managing this, see some of the variation and like look at the human element and look at the personal element of what this inclusion moderation stuff might look like, what this exclusion radicalization stuff might look like, and take individuals at face value. Don't think of like broader ideological strokes of people moving to the right or moving to the left and stuff like that. And Khalil Anani has done some work on this as well, and Wendy Perlman and political science, and like there's like big push of like understanding emotions and what they work with, and like subjective and individual type interpretations, as opposed to like larger sweeping remarks about what the organization is or isn't. The other thing is that when we look at how the organization operated, and we write about this a bit in the book, is that at the moment in which there were violent factions within the organization, there was also a group of the organization that was traveling and speaking to different usar. Usar are like the small, or shu'ab, like small sort of like neighborhood level organizations or neighborhood level communities of people who are from the Brotherhood that would say things like, maintaining the Egyptian state and Hifaz ala al-Dawla al-Masriya is one of our core objectives of in this time. And this was like 2015, 2016, the height, like post Rab'a, it was as violent as it had gotten, right? Where we're seeing like extrajudicial killings happening in the street. There's mass repression, mass protest. So like it was a moment in which the state was being, at least post Rab'a, the most violent. But we're seeing that, or people are saying that maintaining the sanctity or like the safety of the Egyptian state was of the utmost importance, was one of their goals. And then the last bit I'll say about this is that repression affects people, right? Or unless my dissertation is wholly wrong and repression does not matter, which is a possibility, I think repression does really matter, and it changes people's psyches and it affects communities, but I don't think it's linear in any way. we were talking about Vivian's work. I think Vivian's work is really important in that, as understanding like trauma and repression as being interpreted communally, not necessarily being linear, right? It's not a binary. It's not a 0 or a 1, right? So the way, and when we talk about like the difference between what happened under Nasser and under Mubarak and under Sadat, repression is also contextual, right? I've worked on people who have undergone sexual violence in prisons in Egypt, and we've worked on them I've documented and worked on men and women and members of the LGBT community, and everyone people undergo the same act of violence, but people interpret it different, right? And they interpret it differently because of their own experiences and because that this violence is also understood within a context, right? So like repression is worse now for the average Egyptian and for the average Ikhwani because you feel as though you are and similar like you are betrayed by you're betrayed by an organization that doesn't hear or understand you. You're betrayed by a society that doesn't hear and understand you. And whereas in like the 60s, you can through some like acrobatics find yourself in Saudi Arabia and teaching at a university or a school there or whatever. You don't even have that same outlet. So you're like gaslit essentially by a world and a society and that makes it worse. Repression under Mubarak, not to discount anyone's experience, and the body keeps a score and community keeps tabs and all this type of like really important psychological stuff that we need to take into account. But repression under Mubarak was like had a different social currency, right? Like you are not the purpose was not to annihilate. The purpose was to like take someone in for a little bit, disrupt whatever plan they had going on. The relationship between Ikhwan and the security apparatus was there. So it was understandable if someone's like father or mother or like some tragedy happened, you can make a phone call and the person will go like see their dying parent or whatever, right? But in the situation we're in now, and like what Ayyash was saying was really important, the state does not have a strategy about how to deal with this, right? And when people don't have answers, they think we can just annihilate it. And when you you try to annihilate an organization, there is no back and forth that creates what that politics and that dynamism is.
Yeah, maybe a couple of quick points on that. So I think that about inclusion is that a comparison with the Turkish experience actually could be very important because I think that what has been going on in Turkey, for example, since the 1980s, Turkey has been through a much harsher repression than the Egyptian or the Egyptian regime has been inflicting on its people. But the thing about Turkey is that 3-4 years later, the military they gave up power to some extent, and then the civilians were running the country, and people who are actually from an economic background, some people like Mahmoud Muhyiddin, for example, could be they worked very hard to rebuild the democracy in Turkey, and that's why I think that Islamists actually they were able to rebuild their constituency and to keep holding on to their peaceful ideology. But one important thing to say about the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, and again, this speaks to the moral agency and the responsibility of the Muslim Brotherhood, is that the founding texts of Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were not that clear. They are ambiguous, they are vague, and sometimes they are very hollow. And when the Muslim Brotherhood started facing real problems, real society problems, they couldn't answer to these problems, and they couldn't face these problems with the texts or with the codes from Hassan al-Banna. The Muslim Brotherhood has failed to produce intellectuals over the past 60, 70 years, and the only person who came up with new ideas was Sayyid Qutb. It was a very difficult phase for the Muslim Brotherhood that actually is still debatable inside the Muslim Brotherhood. So for many inside the Muslim Brotherhood, including supreme leaders or general guides, Murshidin al-Ammi, many of them actually, or some of them, they didn't agree with Sayyid Qutb's idea. So yeah, I think repression, as Amr said, repression affects people, but also the accountability and the transitional tools to fix what's going on in the repressive regimes, I think it could affect how people think. The societal factors and the personal factors could be much more important, and we have some of our friends who have been doing work on that. To the extent that actually, I think the right question to be to ask at some point, it will be why not much larger? Why didn't the whole Muslim Brotherhood actually turn to violence? And it's not why did we have just a few hundred members of the Muslim Brotherhood who turned to violence? I think it's important to know this. One last thing about what Amr's thing, it's about the society and the state and how the president and the government is introducing itself as the carer for the religion. And I mean, over the past few years, Egypt has been through one of the worst, of course, crackdowns on human rights in its history. But let's talk about religion, because many people actually were arrested for insulting religion or insulting beliefs. Many people were arrested because of many female, not activists, actually, they are TikTokers and people on social media. They were arrested for immorality and debauchery. Yeah. And yeah, if you read the prosecutor's statements that come out, yeah, you'll find them. I think if there is a sheikh, if there is a Muslim scholar who wrote them, it won't be much different at all. And I think it's really important to understand how society and how the state is affecting also religion, and not to be limited to the stereotypes that Islamists they are just manipulating religion, because actually everyone in the Middle East is doing it, and actually the states are the biggest manipulators for the religion.
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add on really quickly. When back to the radicalization, exclusion radicalization element of this, is that when not all violence is created equal. Do you know what I mean? I think that's important to know as well. Like in the context of, and this is not condoning anything anyone has done, but in the context of like the post 2013 stuff, the nature of the violence that was being committed was very different, right? Like it wasn't a group of people organizing to bring down the Egyptian state. It was people who were, and there's a great book called Bleeding Hearts on this. There's a bunch of like interesting research that's been done on this as well. And like there was like violence, and talk about this about a bit in the book, the violence that the some groups within the Brotherhood then started mainly around like protecting or securing protests, right? And there was a big gendered element to it too. Sorry, where and some of this actually happened. Some of this was probably inflated a bit, where like officers would kidnap women off the streets or arrest women, and some of these women were sexually assaulted. And there's some narratives about and stories about women who needed to get. Sorry, some of this might get a little graphic. They needed to smuggle birth control in because these women were being raped by officers and stuff like that. And a lot of that sort of like really incited violence. So it was not an ideological stance against state, and it's not a liberation against state or whatever. But a lot of it was very selective in that sense that like there is no justice system. There is nothing. There's no recourse for any of this. There's impunity. There's again, back to like Ayyash talking about state religiosity. There's a sheikh that's like, these are khawarij, idrub fil malyan, like hit them where it hurts, hit them all, kill them all, right? Do you know what I mean? So this is the context at which like some of this radicalizations, it's not necessarily exclusion. It's like the lack of accountability. There isn't a just society. There isn't a justice system. There isn't a rule of law. There isn't any of these recourse mechanisms in which we're seeing a group of people who are choosing not to engage with and like taking on means that are quite extreme. I think like it's more reactionary than it is ideological. And is it like, sure, some people might like use religious rhetoric, but I think the way we think about, or the way personally I think about religious rhetoric is some like this stuff exists within society. Do you know what I mean? And as like you're a group, you're going to organize, you're going to pull from the ideas that are there, and you're going to move on with it, right? And then what we saw with most of these organizations is that it is not the case that they were all like arrested away or killed away. I think like it was selective to a point. Some of these people were able to like find the person who raped his sister, find the person who killed his mom, find the person who like arrested his dad or whatever. And then like the nature of the grievance changed and they moved on, right? So it wasn't the case that like the security element, the security fix to this actually worked. It was a case of like alas, they were done and they went.
Yeah, but that's very interesting because when you look at other research on movements that become violent, that it's often it's people who are there to protect a protest, then they develop the skills of violence and they become sort of the skilled violence givers. But that leads me to my next set of questions, which is around organizational dynamics. And again, there's a lot of literature on different kind of groups that looks at what happens to organizations when they're repressed, what happens to organizations when they grow old, in terms of the oligarchy and all that kind of stuff that stuff happens, or what happens to organizations that become more professionalized, etc. But I think what's really interesting about your book, you show that during 2010s, this is not just a crisis caused by imprisonment and executions and exile. You know, the structures of the organization start to break down because the people who used to occupy those positions are no longer there. But there's also this change in a legitimacy or an authority paradigm as to who has the authority on what basis. And I think you make very interesting points that there's a difference between how authority was actually given to people in Iran and what their institutional position was. So sometimes people who were more junior had more authority because they were from an old generation or because they had been in prison under Nasser. And so there was not that match. And then you have these new experiences of people, younger members who are being tortured, who also have had this kind of the ordeal. And that then, of course, changes how they see the authority of the others. And I wonder also whether there's an element in that some of the people who joined in 2010 or who became more kind of active, for them political activism and street activism was sort of the main action, whereas for the older leadership the main action was about religious community, sort of looking after each other, but not kind of street activism, etc. So can you say a bit more how you see these organizational dynamics impacting on people's views of authority and their place in the organization, how these different repressive tactics from the states impacted on those internal organizational dynamics. But also this, what you said earlier, that the Muslim Brotherhood didn't come up with answers. And so how does that then feed into this kind of organizational mix, but also what would the future then look like, I guess?
So the first thing that comes to mind when you say this is a couple of anecdotes. And the first of which is someone we spoke to who grew up in a very in a household of a very high-ranking Ikhwani, who was married to someone who was the son of another high-ranking Ikhwani member. And we were talking to her, and they was interviewing her. Like, so we were very lucky that we were doing these interviews when there were two big factions, a faction led by Ibrahim Munir, who was based here in London, and Mahmoud Hussein, who was based in Turkey. And both of these factions really wanted to prove they were right. And as probably you found in your research sometimes, when people are fighting and they want to prove they're right, they're more eager to talk, right? Which was cosmic luck on our end, but it really helped with our book. But essentially we were talking to her and I was like, okay, given the factions, given everything that's going on, how do you feel about this? And she said, I realized that there's no such thing called Ikhwana Nifo anymore, right? And Ikhwana Nifo is something that if you spent any time in Ikhwani circles, you hear Ikhwana Nifo, the people high up, right? The people who are at the helm of the organization that certainly come off as having a crystal ball through which they're making decisions that are informed and that are deep and that are insightful and that are research-based. But then in the midst of this crisis, you realize, there was no crystal. It was probably at best an 8-ball that they were faking and saying a yes or no, right? So there wasn't a there. And I think that's when a lot of the legitimacy and secrecy in which the organization had to build and was rooted, and the way that they view hierarchy and authority sort of broke down when push came to shove and there was nothing to look up to. People looked up and they saw nothing, and the people looked up and they saw no one. And I think that even though this person, this person grew up at a very elite Ikhwani household, so to say, was said verbatim, I still believe in the ideas, but I don't believe in the organization anymore. The organization could die. And again, this is a very serious thing to hear from Ikhwani, because at some point the organization is more important than the idea, and that's one of the problems that we discussed, right? And the other anecdote that comes to mind is someone who was born in mid to late 90s, right? And who in 2014 was arrested, and in prison they had something they called it's quite interesting, like it's sort of like a news agency, or operated technically as a news agency, but in prison they called it Shu'un al-Ma'nawiyya, which is different than Shu'un al-Ma'nawiyya is like public morale, so to say, right? And that probably tells you a little bit about how seriously or not seriously they took the news, in the sense that like they would get like a shred of information that was probably true, but then they'd like blow it up to be something that's not. As in, they'd say that they would hear that there was a protest, a small protest at a university, for instance, in Alexandria, where they may have been, and people, by the time this is shared in prison, they'd be like, people are coming to liberate us, right? Or the streets are way too loud to be ignored by the government. So anyways, the person we were talking to, let's call him Omar for the sake of just making the story go fast. So Omar was like, I realized at some point that the stories that I'm hearing in prison and what I'm hearing from my dad when he comes and visits me are quite different. So when we had a visitation, everybody visits together, right? Like all or prisoners at the time were all put in the same room, and they saw their families, or many families saw, like everyone was in one room, similar to how you would think of like a U.S. visitation, or how it's portrayed in Hollywood, right? If it's not behind a glass mirror or a glass. Can't use language. Screen. Thank you. So he goes and he talks to his dad, and he gets some more news, and he goes to the more senior Ikhwani leaders that are there, and he says, I don't know where you guys are getting your information, but I have a paper here that was just like copied verbatim from what's actually happening in the streets, and I want to share it with you just so you're not giving people wrong information, right? And he said, well, you don't have a place here. This is for us. This is for the senior Ikhwanis. You are just a kid. And what he said was like, prison has flattened all of us, right? You're here just like me. We're both prisoners, right? So whatever seniority dynamics happened before sort of did not translate to that context. They translate in some ways in terms of like organizational and hierarchical power, like who is going to like distribute the food when it comes in, who's going to share whatever. But when it comes to this flow of information stuff, it sort of flattened out a bit to where his legitimate, like he was able to, this young Omar was able to build legitimacy based on this more ordeal he was going, whereas the senior person, just because he had undergone prison or because he was like technically hierarchically higher than he was, did not have the same, couldn't use that anymore, right? They've both been to the same camp, so to say. They both have the same cap on, or like not to degrade prison to that, or to belittle prison in that way. So and I think that shifts, right? Like in the midst of this crisis that was going on, they organized a number of youth to come and to talk to about like, for every side to convince the other about that they were right. And people would be like, we went through this in the 60s and we know what's right. And younger folk would be like, we just came out of this and we're telling you you're wrong. One of the interesting things about the legitimacy aspect, and I promise I'll stop talking in a minute, is that like there's been quite, don't have a tremendous amount of data to say that there's been a shift, but we know like there's some organization that's or like a group of students, graduate and undergraduate students, who have organized into like a community of about 200 people who are mostly Ikhwan or just left the Ikhwan, who are studying social sciences. So it's like everything from science, sociology to anthropology. And I think this is quite a shift. And it's not because if you've done any CVE type studies or radicalization stuff, there's always the question of like, why are they all engineers, right? Maybe because engineers think they're smarter than everyone else, but we can keep that aside. But I think the shift towards social sciences is interesting in and of itself, because they're all people who are trying to understand how did this happen to us and how do we make sure it doesn't happen again. The stickiness of this is still to be debated, right? I don't think that Ikhwan are undergoing a certain like internal revolution in which they're going to come out of this as the Democratic Party or like the Green Progressives of the world, right? But there is a possibility. There is a possibility that some of these ideas, some of the explanations of how they're wrong about a lot of stuff, and the grievances these people that have pushed into social sciences might make it up the ladder, might shift something. But regardless, I think it's an interesting and important development to some of the, because it doubts people's legitimacy and authority.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time, so yeah, I keep this very short. But yeah, I just say an anecdote as well, a personal one. because I was with the Muslim Brotherhood actually until 2011, and my father joined the Brotherhood before me, and he left it even before me. But when my father was trying to push me to praying time and religious stuff, he was telling me that I'm dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood as any communist would deal with Hizb al-Tagamma, the Communist Party in Egypt. And I then in 2009 I was arrested actually, and the state security officer almost told me the same thing. When he asked me many questions, he said that no, you're not Ikhwan, you're Hizb al-Wasat. You are with the younger generation of Ikhwan who are interested in politics and not religion, And I think this generational shift between religion and politics, was seen for a Brotherhood member like my father, and for a state security officer like Mahmoud Mursi, and the thing is that it's very clear for the members and the leaders alike. I mean, recently a member of the Muslim Brotherhood was telling us that he attended this conference in Turkey, where with some members, and one of the highest ranking leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood was telling them that I have seen it was actually a mixed conference, so females and males were there. So he was saying that it's very strange that you are talking to each other. It's very strange that you are not praying at night, and this is not what the Muslim Brotherhood is. For them, they were participating to know how to strategize and how to see the Muslim Brotherhood plans for the future if they have any. But actually, for the leaders, no, they thought that the most important thing for them is to be devout Muslims, to be religious enough. Although religion is not an integral part in the policy of the Muslim Brotherhood, I believe so. I think they are a sector of the Egyptian society that's affected by the religiosity of the society in Egypt. But it is very important actually in the ascending organizationally in the organization. So the promotion that is happening, and actually it's a very sad truth about the Muslim Brotherhood that they actually, many of them, they want to prove that they are religious to their superiors, for them to know that they are good enough for them to be promoted to a better membership position or a leadership position. So and of course the repression actually, it affects all of this, or how the state is dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood is affecting how the relation to religion, and usually in normal circumstances, the interpretation that you will get from religion about, I don't know, again opposing the regime, or being in the opposition, or being in a political party or in a political coalition, their choices and their interpretation of the founding texts of Islam, Quran and the Hadith, they will use much different interpretation if they are under pressure, and if you'll find what ISIS is interpreting from Islam in the old books of Muslim scholars, and you'll find how, I don't know, the AG party, Erdogan is not that, but I mean, you'll find very progressive Muslims using much different interpretations in different contexts because of the conditions and the circumstances they are in. So I think again, the state is a very important factor in how people respond and how people interpret their ideology and their texts.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Right. How long can we go on for? Because it's a bit late. We can go on. Okay, good. So yes, the floor is open. And, please, when you ask a question, introduce yourself, and then we get from there. Sorry.
And so my name is Jeroen. I'm a master's student at King's College London. And so one of the biggest state sponsors of Muslim Brotherhood, like we think it is Qatar. And like in 2022, the both countries cut the ties with the Qatar because for several reasons. But one of the reasons was their state sponsorship of the Muslim Brotherhood. And very recently, they restored their ties. They met in the desert of Ayula. And so does this mean that the Kingdom of Qatar has stopped sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood? And if it is, would you assess this as the actions of the financial support of the government, one of the significant factors for the existential crisis of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, let's take 3 questions as a short bundle. Are there any? Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you both very much. Rupert Wallace from I'm a former student here at the LSE. Can I ask you a question in 2 parts? And it's a much broader question, and I haven't read the book. The first is the type. Can I come back to the title? Is there a suggestion that the existential crisis is also for Egypt as opposed to Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood? And the second thing is 100 years on from Hassan al-Banna's founding of the Muslim Brotherhood, when of course the whole polity was not about Islam. Is there now, could there be a suggestion, why is the word Muslim in the expression Muslim Brotherhood? And you mentioned about confusion about Islamism, Islamic, Islam, and yet there is the very word of a member of Islam in the title.
Yes.
Hi. I'm Hameen, I'm a PhD student at UCL. One thing both of you guys talked about is CC's use of like religious language and rhetoric. And if that's the case, what actually is the crux of the anti-Muslim Brotherhood sort of rhetoric domestically in Egypt now? Because I think from the West it's portrayed as like a religious secular divide, and the opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood are portrayed as sort of like secular opponents. But if they themselves are also using a lot of religious rhetoric, then what are they really, how are they defining themselves against the Muslim Brotherhood?
Let me just pick up from the last question on the religious secular divide and the anti-MB rhetoric. I think one book that's really, you might have read this already, but Liz Nugent's After Repression book is really, really good because it talks about like how repression affects people's psyche and then how MBs view their own repression as opposed to the leftists in Egypt, and how that brings them together at some points, and how the state uses that to bring them together at some points and to pull them apart, and the implications of that in terms of polarization and stuff like that. When you think of the so that's just a quick note. The religious secular divide, that's to say that the religious secular divide I think is real, and it's based in grievances, but it's not really it's cleared in ideological rhetoric. But I don't think, especially in Egypt, there's not a lot of ideology really, because there's not a lot of policy really, because it's an autocratic state, right? Like there's some big ideas that people assimilate to, but when you think of like the religious secular divide in Egypt, it goes back to the 70s, and if you follow the people, there are people who are just yeah, I mean, either wrote reports about each other, were like some or really mean to each other. Like I think this might be like I don't think it's that real, to be completely honest. I think it's real in terms of there are grievances. I think it's real in terms of that people really, like the networks have been established and developed and stuff like that. But I think it has more to do with like what the state is doing to repress and who's favoring over the other. But it's not that ideological, because like there hasn't been space to develop enough ideology. And I don't think and ideologies haven't been really tested, right? So like leftist ideology since in the last, like from Sadat onwards, hasn't really tested in terms of its like mobilizing capacity, or in terms of like how much of a solution is it providing to people's problems. Hisham Salam's Classless Politics is also like a great book on this as well, and because it starts this from it says the history of this from the 70s onward. In terms of like the anti-MB rhetoric by the state, I think a lot of it is that these are like religious deviants, and where like state religion is like true religion, and like should be doing what we're doing, and this fits within like a larger, broader thing of like the politics of Islam in the West, and what the UAE is doing, and what the Abrahamic faith might mean or might not mean, and stuff like that. So like I think it's part of like a larger movement of Muslim quietism that's spreading, and I think that's like more becoming part and parcel of state religion, and there's something more to say about that. And also, like, some of the anti-MB rhetoric is that, like, they were part of destruction that happened and instability and stuff like that. So there's a lot to hate there. And then I like just really quickly on the existential crisis of Egypt. And I'll leave the rest to you. I think Egypt is in an existential crisis, except that like it's a lot worse for them, because there are expectations that they might default on their loans. I think some of the Egyptian government has some of the problems that the Ikhwan has, right? In the sense that they don't have new ideas. in the sense that there's an oligarch that does not want to let go, and in the sense that I think like the cabinet of like civilian folk that they're gonna pull out to like continually justify the shelf lives of them get continuously shorter and shorter and shorter because the state keeps on getting like increasingly ridiculous, right? So it's a crisis that, and also by eliminating the Muslim Brotherhood, the state does not have a political counterpart that they can talk to, right? Which is like a big issue security wise. So if people go like are marching on the street, like you can't, an officer can't call Khairat al-Shawqat or whoever in the organization and be like, there's tens of thousands of people, we'll give you guys what you want. You just everyone has to go back home now, right? There's a situation now where they've created like a different security threat of sorts, where people are mobilizing in ways they're not 100% sure of, are feeling things they're not. It's just harder to penetrate a non-organization than it is to penetrate an organization, right? So yeah, they have some threats, but I think in some ways they're similar, in some ways they're different.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I'll also address some of Rob's questions first. So about the existential crisis of Egypt, actually we don't really talk about this, but I think you're right. There is a really good book. It was not translated yet by Mohammed Naim. Mohammed Naim, he's an Egyptian analyst, leftist one, and he wrote about this, that the Egyptian society actually is in a phase of this. Right? Disenfranchised. I'm sorry. Yeah, and I think it's we said in the book that the Muslim Brotherhood is a mirror actually to the Egyptian society in a way. And yeah, the crises that the Muslim Brotherhood are going through, we can see very similar crises like them in the Egyptian state, in the government, in even in the church actually. To some extent, and we need in Egypt, and this is what Naim has been saying, a new social contract. I know it's a very big word. I know it's a very difficult thing to do, but yeah, it could be difficult. Naim actually is very happy about it. He thinks that it will be very difficult for us or for Egypt to get to a new social contract without a lot of sacrifices, but I agree with him that it's necessary. The other thing about the Muslim part of the Muslim Brotherhood, I think that, and I mean, for the Muslim Brotherhood themselves, they think this, or they believe this is one of the main thawabit. They are one of the main constants in their group, and I think even though I really disagree with the Muslim Brotherhood right now, and especially on this part. But I think they are entitled to choose this, and they are entitled to decide what sources they could rely on. I mean, no one would ask the Christian Democrats in Germany, for example, why are you keeping the name? And I think it's for the Muslim Brotherhood, they think, again, I disagree with that, but they think that Islam is the solution. I think it's a very simplistic and a very naive way to put to label their ideology. But still, they have the right to do so, and the people actually are the ones to decide on whether to vote for them or not. On Qatar, I think it's an important question. It's a political one, and I think maybe there are some people actually in the room that could be more knowledgeable about it than me. But I think that the Muslim Brotherhood has never relied on Qatar as an essential source of livelihood. Yeah, it was one of the not partners, but it was one of the supporters. And Qatar, I think, for the lack of strategy on the end of the Muslim Brotherhood over the past 10 years, yeah, they didn't see them as a good investment. The Egyptians, of course, they played it really well. I mean, they've been working on different fronts. Yeah, some of these fronts are legal or like diplomatic missions and diplomacy, and some others are transnational repression, and clear as the aim. And the Qataris, I think that they thought that the Muslim Brotherhood right now, especially with the new rapprochement between Egypt and Turkey as well, that they will have to find an alternative, or at least they will have to find a way with the Egyptian government. And I think it's true to some extent. So I don't think it's an existential crisis for them, the Qatari support, but I think it affects them And it's not a secret that actually most of the Muslim Brotherhood finances are not in Qatar. Actually, Qatar is a very small state. Many members of the Muslim Brotherhood are in other Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, for example, and their assets are all over the world. I mean, people were bragging about it, that they have buildings in Malaysia, companies in Europe, and even with Iran. Maybe I don't know, and I didn't ask actually because I was afraid to ask one people. But yeah, they were saying that they have assets all over, and the Qataris, they provided a cover for some or at some point. But I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood relied heavily on this.
Just quickly on the Qatar thing, Qatar was like able to bear the cost of like hosting the Taliban, able to bear the cost of hosting Hamas. I think like the stuff with Muslim Brotherhood has to do with exactly what Ayyash was saying. You get to a point where like you're not even a liability. You're not useful. You're like somewhere in the middle of like being not important at all, right? So it doesn't like you're not helping. You're not you're like close. There's just nothing there.
Which is also an indictment in itself. Any other questions? Really, they haven't answered everything.
We do have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Can you start?
Yes, sure. My name is Carmen. We actually met before online. Yes. And nice to meet you. And I'm a lecturer at King's College in the Department of Studies. I was just wondering whether, in your opinion, after conducting such an extensive field trip, whether perhaps the meanings traditionally assigned to organizational survival has changed, particularly in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, when actually we finally, witnessed the complete demobilization of BND, since they seems to have totally, given up what used to be like a sort of transnational advocacy for because of a lot of circumstances and contextual factors also related to exile politics, right? So yeah, I would love to hear from you.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Mohammed, postgraduate Department of Government. Just a broad question. The arrest of Banoshi and the demise of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. What are the prospects of political Islam in the region? Will they continue to work in a democratic framework, or will they resort to violence?
That's not a simple question.
One more question to you. Nice. Three kind of combined. Yes.
I think it might be opening like a can of worms, but does Muslim Brotherhood only exist in Egypt? Well, why is we're looking only on Egypt? But is there a scenario where it actually cannot? Where we think about Muslim Brotherhood as not an Egyptian group?
What do you?
Okay, again, I'll start with the last question. About Egypt, actually, there is a very interesting conversation that I had post 2013, and this was with someone actually whose sister was killed in Rabaa, and he was telling me, and of course he was insanely sad, but he was saying that maybe a silver lining of this is that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt will not be the center of everything, because actually over the past 80 years, the Muslim Brotherhood has proved themselves not the best fit to lead the other Islamists in the region. They didn't provide an example for again, strategy, ideology, or tactics. Other organizations in different. Of course, Egypt is a big and difficult state to be in or to do politics in, but still, the Muslim Brotherhood did not provide an example to the other organizations. So I think, yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood right now in Egypt, I think that given what's happening in Hamas or in Gaza by Hamas, Hamas has been always considered as an offshoot or as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But right now, no one cares. I am a researcher on the Muslim Brotherhood, but I haven't looked at the website of the Muslim Brotherhood to know what their opinion on the situation is. Because now it's the Hamas or the other branches, and it happened in Tunisia as well, and it happened in other organizations or in other countries like Turkey or Morocco. Yeah, these countries and even Jordan, they were able to develop their own organizations and their own not ideologies but tactics and strategies in a way that surpassed the Muslim Brotherhood or the Egyptian Brotherhood in many ways. So yeah, I think we can see a future. I asked Ibrahim Munir actually if the new Murshid or if the new general guide can be an Egyptian leader. And he said, I'd love that, but your brothers would not like it. but yeah, so I'm not sure if this will be an acceptable thing for the Brotherhood in Egypt, but I think it's inevitable that the Muslim Brotherhood will, or the school of thought of the Muslim Brotherhood will have a different manifestation, and Egypt might not be the center of it. The other question actually about the realism and the responses of different movements and how Islamists could react. I think with the situation in Tunisia, we can go back to the history. I mean, Noha, they were subjected to similar and maybe even more pressure and repression in the 80s, 90s, and I think they proved that their ideology and their thoughts can be developed in a different way. And I think the exiles were very important factor in this. So I think it's important to note that there could be different reactions, but the majority of the people who believe in this school of thought, they believe that the movement is too important to sacrifice. So they will not take any decisions that will affect the future of the movement as a whole. So they will not, for example, announce jihad on I don't know, their governments or something, because even not from the ideology part, from a tactical standpoint and from a strategic standpoint, they will not be able to do it, or they will not be able to justify it to their members who are mostly middle class, anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary by nature. They will not be able to justify radical decisions like this, because the essence of their existence is built on the organization or the presence of the organization. So if this violence or if this new tactics will affect or will harm the organization, I think they will not go for it. And that's why I believe that for the Muslim Brotherhood, many members or those members who join violent trends or who turn to violence, they were the offshoots, they weren't the essence of the group. And the ambiguity of the ideology and the societal factors were much more important in the decision than this.
Quickly on your question of organizational survival, my honest answer is I don't know. Like, when do you ever pronounce an organization or
That's what I would have said, by the way.
When do you ever pronounce like an organization or idea dead? There's still money flowing up. There's still people attending USAD. There's still some ideas that are being circulated, but they haven't been tested on the street yet, right? Like, we don't know how many people they can mobilize. We don't know how many people they can recruit. They're getting into some like human resources problems because you don't have much to offer, right? There's not much of an incentive to join the Brotherhood anymore. But it's hard to pronounce anything completely dead. What I can say, well, like, go back to the question about Ghannouchi, the best way to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood or this many Islamist organizations is to just leave them in power for a couple of years, right? Like, I think that if when in Egypt, like, had Morsi would not have lasted, even if everything being free and fair and all that, they probably would, like, their electoral wins started diminishing as and it was only a couple of years, right? Like from the first referendum to the parliament to presidential elections and all that. And like their support dwindles because they are faced with some of the crises that we talk about in the book, right? You realize that you don't necessarily know what you're doing, that the sometimes like organization is important, but when push comes to shove, you need to have policies, you need to have different types of levers of power to continue to mobilize people. So until they're in office for like 2 electoral rounds, I don't think we can pronounce them dead just yet. What I do believe is that if society opens up in Egypt and if politics opens up in Egypt, they are going to have to contend with their past failures, but they're at a better advantage than everyone else just because like they're an incumbent party, similar to how we think of like an elected representative or whatever, that they can snap back into shape faster and better than everyone else, not for any inherent thing other than they might still have some organizational memory and how to do it. Yeah, that's on my end.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for coming and listening, and do remember to take books and tell your friends about it.
Thank you so much.